בכזה אומץ שזה מאוד יועיל.
Hi everyone, good morning. I love to see as many faces as possible, so just as we begin, just really helps. Okay. Just gonna scroll down here and see.
Oh, hi there.
Good morning, good morning, as a kif. Just checking out, saying a virtual hello to everybody. This is great. Yeah. Let's give everybody a minute to open up and okay, does everyone sees me still as however they want to see me, right? I just press something, just tell me that you see me fine. Yeah? Okay, great. Super. So basically, we're gonna start our course for the year. This is the only quiet room in my house since all my kids are learning and home from school. So we're gonna hope that this goes well. I'm going to share a screen. I'm going to go back and forth today between sharing this screen and also just speaking with you. Everyone sees that? It came through? We're good? Thumbs up? Okay, great. Super. So basically, I'm really happy to be back at Matan. For those of you who are, joining, I've seen some of you. I see Eshkolot women that we learned together in Elul. But for the rest of us, I've sort of very intimately been with Matan in the past 2 years, and now we moved back to the area. And I really hope that we'll be able to learn again in Matan at some point this year physically. But either way, I'm thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to see familiar faces and also new faces. And just to lay down, I guess, a few Zoom, I guess, guidelines for how I think this will work best. For some reason, I think Abigail is I'm not seeing the chat. So if Abigail, if you hear me, I really want to be able to see the chats because I want people to be able to ask me questions. So, we might have a few technical things today. I'm sure by next class, we'll have it all figured out.
The chat's available for everybody. You'll be able to see the chats down below.
Okay, I just don't see it because my screen is being shared.
Yeah, you'll see it as soon as you lower the screen.
Okay, so first of all, feel free to write in. Obviously, though, as you know, if we're looking at a slide, I won't be able to see it right away, but I'll see when I close it. I'll stop every few minutes and look at the chat to see if there's any questions. I think the general guideline that people appreciate on Zoom is that people not unmute themselves. I will be happy to unmute at the end, and anyone can ask questions at the end, and those who want to go can go. I think that the best way I've seen so far is that in a larger group that I'll stop in the middle and I'll stop at the end for questions. And other than that, please write into the chat and I'll see it every few minutes and I'll check it out. In terms of materials, source sheets, or anything like that, I will send a source sheet to Abigail. But as long as we're on, sorry, Yardena, not Abigail, sorry, that's who I sent it to. That as we, that every source that we're going to use is going to be on a PowerPoint. I just think that the visual stimulation is really helpful. And so the source sheets will have all the sources. It's really though for those who want to download it and print it and have it in front of them because visually the PowerPoint is uncomfortable for them. But all the sources that we'll look at will be on the slides as well. So if you don't want to look at the source sheet, there's no real need. If anything special comes up, I'll let you know. In terms of books, we really just need a Tanakh. I'll provide everything else throughout the class. And just really a few words about why I wanted to teach this year. I I'm sorry, one more technical question. Yardena, I want to be able to see everybody when I stop sharing my screen, but right now I see you, I see it says Matan Yardena in the background. Can we change that so I see everybody's faces?
It should be, it's on your computer. You do it from speaker view.
Okay, one second. Gallery view, got it. Thank you, perfect. So a few words about why I wanted to teach this.
Can you see me? Because I just fixed it. Can you see my face? It's Ellen.
No, but we'll hopefully see you soon, Ellen.
Next week.
Okay. So a few words about why I wanted to teach this. A few years ago, when I last taught in Matan, we learned the beginning of Sefer Breishit, which I see since Danielle Ziegler has picked up. And that was great, and I really love Sefer Breishit. I love teaching Torah in general. I spent many years in Matan teaching Navi, I guess I've always wanted to teach the stories of Yosef for a few reasons. One is because we share a name, and I know that sounds like really trite, but I guess not only do I share a name, I'm named after obviously my grandfather Yosef. That I was the second girl born after he died, and at that point they said, well, we just have to name her Yosefa because we're not sure anyone else is going to come, and indeed I'm the youngest, and so I guess I relate to Yosef in a lot of ways, and this was, again, I'm sure everybody picks the things they want to teach in different ways, and those who know me know that I always try and speak from the heart, and so I'm just sharing with you very honestly that I think in a lot of ways I relate to Yosef as a character in Tanakh. He's someone with a lot of dreams, a lot of perseverance. He has a lot of clear morals, idealistic, and a really nice dose of chutzpah. And we'll see that as we learn the stories throughout the year. And for good and for bad, that I really relate to a lot of those parts. And the other piece that I really relate to, and this is really unique because we don't always get a sense of individual characters' journeys throughout Tanakh, is that it takes him a really long time to find himself or place himself or find his place among his siblings in his family. I don't think I love my siblings and I have a lovely relationship. And I think like many of us that it takes time to find ourselves within our family, especially if you're the youngest and if you feel like you're a little bit of a different flavor than your other siblings. And so I really relate to that from Yosef. I'm saying this after I had a very long conversation, great, with my older brother, and we've all, come to great places. But like from a totally honest perspective, I really feel like that's a piece of Yosef that I also relate to. And that a lot of times when you have like a very clear vision of what you're supposed to be, or in our case, clear dreams, sometimes it could take you a while to figure out how to place yourself in broader context. And so that's also a piece about Yosef that we're going to talk a lot about. We're going to talk a lot about Yosef. For those who are in the LO class, you had a little taste of this, and we'll see a little bit more of it already this morning. But we're going to really talk about Yosef. We're not going to do psychoanalysis of Yosef. I don't mean it like that, but we're going to talk about how the Yosef story really offers us a tremendous amount of insight into family, into spiritual work within the family. And that's going to be a really central component of our study as well this year. So that's a little bit about why Yosef. Now I'm going to go back to sharing a screen. And I wanted to open up with something that, regardless of what's going on right now, I would have opened with, but I want to open up with something from Rabbi Sachs's introduction to the stories of Sefer Breishit. Rabbi Sachs is not a biblicist per se in the hardcore way that people like me like to get at. I find his work, I'm sure like many people, unbelievably moving, and his introduction, particularly to Sefer Breishit, I really think gets at the core of what Sefer Breishit is coming to talk to us about. And on that note, I also would like to be makdish the shiur to the refuah of Rav Yaakov Tzvi ben Liba, of Rabbi Sachs, who has cancer, who, by the way, got past it twice before, apparently. So please God, it'll happen again this time. He's a tremendous light in our life. And so Bezrat Hashem, it should be the refuah to Rav Yaakov Tzvi ben Liba. And I'll also say that next Thursday, is my father's yortzeit. So I already have a hakdasha for next week. And if anybody ever wants to be makdish the shiurim, there's probably an official financial way to do that through Matan, but also feel free to tell me, and I'm happy to do that as well. Okay, sharing the screen. And thank you for the Mazal Tovs and the doctorate. I did finish that almost 2 years ago. Given in at 39 weeks pregnant, because why not? Okay. Tov. Rabbi Sachs. Okay. Now, we have a question when we open up in the general into Sefer Breishit as why, right, the Rashi approaches this famously, why does the Torah not start with halachot? Okay, and that's a more technical question that we've maybe come up against, when we were in school, and Rashi says the Torah should have started from Rosh Chodesh in Sefer Shmot, and that's a very rabbinic question, meaning why don't we start with halacha? And Rabbi Sachs really looks at this a little bit differently. And he doesn't say, why don't we start with halacha? But he explains why the Torah starts with family. Why does the Torah start from this place? And so I want to read, his words are so beautiful that it's just always worth seeing them inside. Not by accident is Genesis a book about the family. The family is where we learn emotional and spiritual intelligence. There is nothing simple or idealized about the families of Abraham and Sarah. Only much later in Tanakh do we discover that the family will turn out to contain the most compelling metaphors for the relationship between human beings and God himself. He is our father, we are his children. He is our husband, we are his betrothed. The tensions within the patriarchal family are symptomatic of Israel's later, larger battles with God, with humanity, and with itself. Now, each of these paragraphs we can have a whole shiur on, okay? But I just want to touch upon 3 ideas, and this is excerpts from his introduction that I chose, that he speaks about. And the first is this idea is that if indeed the Torah is our prism through which we create a relationship with God, starting with the family is unbelievably poignant, because it's in those relationships that we later use as our mirrors for what it means to have a relationship with God. God as the Father exists in a number of places, although far less in Tanakh than we think. It actually occurs much more in Tefillot. And us really as married to him, as his betrothed, the metaphor of us sinning or harloting against God when we worship other gods. And those metaphors where we use our most intimate relationships, and obviously Shir Shirim, we use our most intimate relationships as metaphors for how we relate to God, is of course the only way we can figure out how to relate to God, because we only have the world we live in. And Rabbi Sachs says that that's one of the significant reasons why the Torah starts with the family, because when we later get to the official God piece about us being God's people and worshiping God through halacha, we'll be able to use the prism of familial relationships in order to relate to God. Okay, and that's piece number 1. There's another significance to the focus of Genesis on the family. Unlike the God of the philosophers, the God of Abraham is a personal God. He is a God who relates to us as persons, sensing our suffering, hearing our prayers, a presence in our lives. And it is in this personal relationship, first and foremost within the family, that he expects us to honor him by honoring others who bear his image no less than we do. And this is a really different idea, where Rabbi Sachs says that we have to first practice what it means to be compassionate, loving, and dedicated within our family before we can really do that with God. Now, I think that this also has a really moving piece, which is that for the most part, as humans, we don't initially worship God. Like even just saying this, watching small kids grow up, which is that there are some children who are unusually spiritual and usually have a sense of what is beyond them. But for the most part, children look at what's around them. They see their family. And what Rabbi Sachs is saying is that, again, learning through Sefer Breishit, which starts with family and then later gets to God, later in further narratives, that we first have an opportunity to work on ourselves, better ourselves, and work on all of our most important character traits that we'll need in our relationship with God. We first have to do that within our family. And that's actually how our life works, right? We first are in the family context, and then later, as we mature, as we psychologically mature, we start to think about what our relationship with God should look like, and correctly so. We don't really psychologically developly think about that until we're in our teens and beyond. And so Rabbi Sachs says that by starting with the book of Breishit, it really reminds us that that's where we're first supposed to work on these contexts, and that God exists within that context. Meaning it's not that I'm only practicing on my family so that I can then worship God, but that God exists in the family, and it's in that context that we can bring him in within those relationships and within that dynamic. A small random piece of sharing, which is that, within the halachic framework, we say brachot before our food, and we say a bracha achrona. And God bless you too. You get exposed to all different people and all different ways of life. I really, really relate and have thought about trying to incorporate in a Jewish way, like a much more overt blessing before eating, and a lot of the ways that religious Christians do before they eat, because I just often feel like bracha achrona, the blessing we say after our food, is much longer than the blessing we say before. But by then everyone's out the door, including myself. Meaning everyone's running to get out of the table by that point, right? It's like, say bracha achrona. Did you say no? Come back, right? It's like it's not like a time of intention. We're able to be much more intentional before we eat food, when we're waiting to eat because we're hungry, and everyone's sitting there because they want to eat food. And I've been trying, and again, within that thought of we're in the family right now, there isn't as much going out, or even a lot, at least within the family, certainly in our house, and like trying to figure out how to bring God into that context when everybody is much more intentional than the end. Anyways, the second part, I think, speaks to that idea a little bit more. Okay, and then he makes a third point. By placing the stories of Genesis before the book of Exodus, with its story of the birth of the Israelites as a nation, the Torah is implicitly telling us the primacy of the personal over the political. Okay, now this is a different piece. Before he spoke about the personal, where we bring God in there, and then ultimately we also have a relationship with God beyond just the personal context of our family. And here he's talking about the dichotomy between the personal and the political. And again, for Rabbi Sachs, read his introduction to Sefer Shemot. He really talks about Sefer Shemot as a political treatise. There's also some really good biblical research on that as well. If we cannot create peace or justice or compassion within the family, we will be unable to do so within the nation or the world. Not until Joseph forgives his brothers, there's some typos here, they're mine, they're not his. Not until Joseph forgives his brothers and is reconciled with them, can the story move on to the larger canvas of history. And so this is really a different piece where he says, in many ways, Sefer Breishit is a microcosm or a jumping point for the rest of Torah. And that idea will come up all throughout our lessons. And he says that if we can't get ourselves together within the family dynamic, then we won't be able to do it when we're trying to live amongst others. If we're not unified within our internal family, then we're going to have a really hard time doing that outside. And only once Yosef and his brothers have their final reckoning and final peacemaking in the last paragraph of Sefer Breishit, he said we were only able to end Sefer Breishit because that peace happened, because they were able to come to a point where everybody recognized each other for what they each could really offer each other, and they really realized that even once Yaakov was dead, that Yosef wouldn't hurt them. And so he says that Sefer Shemot can only happen once that reconciliation occurs at the end of Sefer Breishit. And I guess I wanted to offer one other piece before we jump into the psukim. Hold on one second. That based on this third paragraph, which is that I'm not moving a little bit away from the concept of political for right now, although I'll give two examples. One is that I think that there's a tremendous worth to having ideological movements come from bottom up and top down. But one of the things I guess I've been saying in my house, and I'm sure many people have, I'm sure it's not just me, I've been saying in my house for many years, is that when we talk about how we want our shuls to look, and of course everybody has a very different way of how they would like their shul to look, and inclusion of women and in all different forms. But I said to my husband a long time ago, I said that in order for a shul to look the way we want it, our house has to look the way we want it, meaning a home where women are still largely responsible for the vast majority of it. Again, this is a personal theory. Don't take it too seriously. I don't take myself too seriously either. Okay, but a personal theory is that if we want our shuls to look a certain way, then our house needs to look that way. And if we're still in charge of every single thing going on in our house, and we're the one doing all the men have all the mental load, then it's not true necessarily in the technical sense. Of course, a shul can change while the home changes, but I feel that society, i.e., men and many women, will have less hitnagdut or less opposition to changes when their house reflects a reality like that as well. Meaning, if your house is a shared space, again, not speaking about specific tasks, what everyone does, male, female, lo mishaneli, but once the house is a shared space where everybody has their own space as well, I really believe that a shul will be able to look that way with a lot less ideological opposition. And Rabbi Sachs is saying something also very similar here, which is that the family is a microcosm for something much larger, whether it's a microcosm for your relationship with God, or it's a microcosm for your relationship with other nations around you, that the family, for better or for worse, is an initial reflection of how that'll work. And if we can't, there are many of us who are really functional in our work life and are in our home life. We're a lot less functional than people would think we are when they see us from the outside. But the truth is that it doesn't really work like that. Meaning, again, here I'm just speaking from a psychological perspective. And by the way, one of the people that is a lot behind a lot of the things I talk about, and I will bring her up by name, is Harriet Lerner. I'm sure many of you have read her. She was big and, dance of all them, dance of anger, dance of intimacy, dance of motherhood. There's many of them. I'm sure many of you who are much older than me remember her when she first came out. She's still out there. And I, being 34, and a mother of 4 little girls, still find her just as insightful. And she's still working at it. She just came out with a new book 2 years ago about how to apologize. She's phenomenal. And she's like one of my people that I really like to look to for guidance. There'll be a whole bunch of names that'll come through here, because another one of my subdoctorates is that I like to read a lot of self-help and therapy books. So it'll come up in this course of ours. So, and she talks a lot about this idea, which is that we think that we're diverting energy, meaning we think that, well, I have a terrible relationship with my child, or a terrible relationship with my spouse, or a terrible relationship with my family, with my parent, or not even terrible, but just like sort of on a low flame at a distance, whatever it is. And we think that, okay, we're keeping it there because that's how we're going to keep the anxiety low and we'll function. But in reality, that negative energy comes out in other ways. And we're just bound to repeat a lot of those patterns if we don't deal with them in their initial context. And Rabbi Sachs is talking about that on a divine level and on a political level as well. So I'm just bringing it to the familial level also, that our family is a microcosm. And we're going to see that come up time again in the story of Yosef. And how the story of Yosef is meant to be a microcosm for the broader story of the nations, and that it behooves us to really see it through those prisms. Any questions on our chat? Any thoughts? You can write in. Okay, not on mute right now, but if anyone wants to write in, I'm happy to take a minute and speak. Okay, over here. We will open to the beginning. We are going to study Bezrat Hashem the first 11 psukim today of the story. One broader piece about the book of Sefer Breishit. We're coming in in the last unit. Okay, Prakim Lamed Zayin ad Nun, okay, the last 14 prakim, which is going to be our study for this year, and one of the main topics I would say that really occupies the minds of much of the scholars who study the stories of Breishit is what they call the secular nature of the story, and of course, in very biblical critical fashion, they really decide that there are 2 parts to the story of the story of Yosef. There's the religious version and there's the non-religious version, and the versions were put together. Once in a while, we'll jump into those questions just for the clarity that they offer us on the psukim themselves, but the theories themselves aren't particularly interesting for our type of study here in Matan. But what is important to notice is not necessarily that we could divide presence of God into two pieces or not, but that there is a noticeable absence of God being active in the story of Yosef. And when I say active, I mean that unlike Abraham and Yitzchak and Yaakov's early life, there is no overt revelation of God in the story of Yosef. It's a very clear switch. It's even a clear switch because right when we open up into Sefer Shoftim, Moshe will have his revelations from God. But the story of Yosef is really unusually quiet, and God is only there when the characters speak about him. And so I wanted this. I brought again interesting, but only from an academic perspective. It's not interesting for a real read, but a really interesting book that is written by a scholar named Humphreys, and it's called God as a Character in the Book of Genesis. And he speaks very much at length, but here I just brought one quote from where he speaks about this lack of presence of God in the story of Yosef. The specific words and actions that move the narrative are those of human actions. Again, think about how in the story of Yosef, there's no building a mizbeach, there's no, God said, go back to Haran. There's no overt divine revelation in the story of Yosef, and it's a very big change from all the prakim that came before. So the words and actions that move the narrative are those of human characters, especially those of Joseph, who in his commanding authority and effective control seem in many ways to assume God's place in the last segment of the Genesis story. We'll talk a lot more about that when we get to the area where Yosef divides up the produce in the land of Egypt, how he really assumes almost like a godlike role. We'll get to that later on. God receives recognition of the sovereignty he first demonstrated in creation, but only as he is created in turn by his creations in images that serve their own designs for their own lives. Okay, so let's speak about that in a second in like just regular human terms, that we've come to a point in history where it's our job, we're learning through this lack of God overtly in the story of Yosef, to bring God into our own life. Throughout, and the truth is that I don't expect you to remember, but we spoke about this as well in the first unit in Breishit Aleph Ad Yud Aleph, for those who were in that course, that even within Aleph Ad Yud Aleph, there's a noticeable receding of God throughout that unit, where in the beginning, obviously God creates the earth, heavy hand in creation, telling man what he's supposed to do, and throughout those stories, and obviously through the story of Noach, there's really an ebb of God's role in the way that the world functions. And here we see it though in a much more dramatic way, that once God has been engaged in the story, in all the narratives of the patriarchs, that now we really see that God isn't there. And the idea that not just Humphreys, but many really write about, is that we're seeing that it is our job in life to engage God in our life. And we'll see that Yosef does this in really critical moments, and it's what makes Chazal classify him as Yosef the Tzaddik. Yosef is not an Av, okay? He's not a forefather. He doesn't have that same revelatory relationship with God that the forefathers do, but he's called Yosef a Tzaddik because a Tzaddik is somebody who lives in the human world and brings God into his life. Whereas a patriarch is somebody who is really just almost a more than human figure, a saintly figure. Again, that's not the right Jewish term, but he's really a figure that is godly in the way that he interacts with the world. And so Yosef is our first model in the Torah of a regular person who, if he does well and if he brings God into his life and sees God as being really central, then he or she will be a tzaddik. And so that's just another really important piece when it comes to understanding these stories. Okay, and now if you want, you can open up in your own Tanakh. I'm sorry, the lack of symmetry of the plants behind me is bothering me when I move in. There we go. Okay. Much better to my eye at least. So you can open up in your Tanakh. I will also be bringing the psukim on the slides. I'm just looking at a question from Linda. Yeah, I do think that. I think that that it is definitely a model. Linda asks, is the reduction of God's open role in the world throughout the book of Breishit a model for us over generations to move from times with Nevuah to without? I definitely think so. Now, as we move on in the stories of the Torah, there are obviously going to be many more revelatory moments with God. But certainly, I do think that can act as a model for us. The Yosef story specifically, more than any other story in the Torah, because God, once we get into the Midbar, really is much more present. So yes, I definitely think so. Okay. The opening psukim of our story. וישב יעקב בארץ מגורי אביו, בארץ כנען. אלה תולדות יעקב. יוסף בן 17 שנה היה רואה את אחיו בצאן. Now, our opening psukim here, by the way, the commas, they're obviously not intrinsic. They're not necessarily following the ta'amim in the Torah. They're there on the website that I really like the way that they have the fonts of the psukim. So I'm gonna, feel free to ignore the comments. They're not inherent to the psukim. So we have here two important pieces, and one of them connects us to the previous story. The previous story in Sefer Breishit is the story of Esav. If those of us who recall or who've learned Sefer Breishit before, that in our discussion when we have two siblings and one of them sort of is chosen and one of them moves out of the spotlight of history, the way that they move out the spotlight of history is kind of like the credits in the movies, where you have at the end, all the credits sort of flying through at the end. So with the siblings that get cut off, which is Ishmael and Esav, we have a long list of all of their progeny, and then we never hear about them again. And the list of their progeny is kind of like the credits in the movies. So right before Perek Lamed Zayin, we have the progeny and Alufei, the leaders of Edom, who are the descendants of Esav. And then we have our opening, which says, Vayeshev Yaakov, that Yaakov dwells in the land of his father, in Eretz Canaan, and specifically, we'll see, in the area of Hebron. And that Vayeshev Yaakov, a lot of the Parshanim, the commentators point out that it's in contrast to Esav, meaning Esav moves away, he moves to the area of Seir, but Yaakov, he dwells in the it's kind of like, again, in Israel, if you take a very informal research, most children live close to where their parents are. Again, it's not such a huge place, so going far is a much bigger deal. And so Yaakov showing very much in that he's continuing his parents' ways. He's the chosen child, which we'll get back to soon. That he stays and lives in the area of Canaan, and that's in direct contrast to Esav, who comes right before.
Joseph, you said Yaakov. Joseph.
No, here I'm talking about Yaakov. Okay, we're speaking about
Oh,
Yaakov. And Yaakov
sorry.
is in direct contrast to Esav. And
Yeah.
Yaakov lives in the area of his father, of Yitzchak. And now we're going to see our introduction to the story of Yosef, which is in the second pasuk. Now, all of the Parshanim and all modern commentaries all have to deal with the very important question in the second pasuk. So important that I didn't want to overlook it, which is that Ele Toldot Yaakov is an introduction based on all the other times it comes up in Sefer Breishit, and this is also very prominent in the first 11 prakim, but not only, it also comes up earlier on. We'll see that soon in a minute in the Rashbam's commentary. When you have Ele Toldot, afterwards is supposed to be a list of all your children. Okay, it's supposed to be an introduction to all the descendants of that person. But we have here instead is that it says these are the Toldot. Here it's translated as generations, which I think is a pretty good translation. But again, translations are always a commentary. And then all it does is list us Yosef. And so we have to ask ourselves, what's going on? Now, we could say maybe it's already a precursor to the fact that Yosef is a favorite, but on a technical level, all the Parshanim are very up in arms about this, because Toldot is a technical term that is supposed to connote, now I need to list all of the people who, all the children of that person. So where are all the rest of Yaakov's children? And I brought three explanations here. We'll start with the one on the left. Okay, you see my mouse, right, when I do that? Okay, so number one, this then is the line, this is Nahum Sarna's commentary, the JPS commentary in Breishit, one of the better commentaries in all Sefer Breishit, really, if you ever want to invest in any full commentary, the JPS is just phenomenal, all of them, all 5 of them. This then is the line of Jacob, contrary to usage. No genealogy follows this formula, right? There is no list. Mention of Yosef and his brothers is here, in effect, an abbreviated genealogy, the full version of which is already listed later on. Now, Professor Sarna, Alav Shalom, is not particularly bothered by this issue, and he says, okay, it mentions Yosef specifically, and then it also mentions the brothers. It says the Achim. No big deal, sababa. It's not a full list, but the list itself, already was listed in Perek Lamed Hey, so we don't really need a full list here. Okay, he's not particularly bothered by this issue. He's like, okay, it's not exactly the way the formula is used in the previous parts of Sefer Breishit, but not necessarily an issue. Okay, I want to dig a little bit deeper because maybe there's more of a message we can get from this than just that it's a non-technical issue. Rashi. אלה של תולדות יעקב, אלה יישוביהם וגלגוליהם עד שבאו לכלל יישוב. And Rashi says, and this really bothers his grandson in a second, the Rashbam, that he says, no, in this case, toldot can't mean really generations. It's not going to mean the children, but it's going to mean that it's the happenings. It's the events. Toldot here means the events that will happen. And these are all the events that eventually lead to the way that the family was living. And we'll see that the Rashbam elaborates on this and says that it's what leads us to Egypt. It's what gets us there. And so Toldot here, it really does. It breaks away from the way that it's used in the previous places in Sefer Breishit, and it really just means that these are the recountings. These are the stories of Yaakov. Okay, we'll dig a little bit deeper in the Rashbam on the right hand side. אלה תולדות יעקב, אלה המקראות והמאורעות שהראו ליעקב. And he's quoting actually the Ibn Ezra, but it's a very similar commentary that his grandfather Rashi gave. He says, והנה זהב אלו, כי כל אלה תולדות האמורים בתורה וכתובים, יש מהם שמפרש בני האדם, ויש מהם רבים שמפרשים בני בנים, כאשר פירשתי באלה תולדות נוח. And he says, no, this isn't a good shot explanation. And for those of us who remember, but you should know that one of Rashbam's most, this isn't the class in exegesis, so I didn't bring the whole thing, but Rashbam's, one of his most critical commentaries, it's just an invitation to open it up afterwards, is right before what I brought here. Right before what I brought here is one of his programmatic statements about how he comments on the Torah, and it's where the phrase Pshatot HaMitchadshim B'chol Yom comes up, where he says that Rashi, his grandfather, had said to him, if only I had more time to study, I would rewrite my commentary because I've learned so many things since I last wrote. And so there's just a beautiful, really rare insight into the personal lives of the commentators, and it's right before what I brought you here. So invitation to check it out. And he says, "Ma pitom." That's not a good explanation. He's quoting Ibn Ezra, but it's also a little bit of a, it's a jab also against his grandfather. He says it's not a good pshat explanation. It always talks about the children. It's not about the events of their lives. And he says, I already explained that when I spoke about Noach, and here he brings an abbreviated version. ויהי נוח בן 500 שנה, ויולד נוח את שם ואת חם ואת יפת, ואחרי כן מפרש כי העולם חטאו. ונוח מצא חן וכולי וכולי, אלה תולדות נוח בני בניו, האח כי 3 בנים היה לו, עד שעולים ל70 בנים שהיו 70 אומות. And there he says that they're באמת, it says the names of his children, Shem, Cham, ויפת. And he says, וכן ביעקב, למעלה כתיב, ויהי בני יעקב 12 וגומר, ומפרש לבסוף, אלה בני יעקב אשר ידעו לו בפדן ארם, ויבוא ליצחק. And he says, earlier, just like Professor Sarna said, in Perek Lamed Hey, it told you who Yaakov's children were. And where they were when, it says when his children were made, right? Where they were when the children were born. It's funny because in modern Hebrew, people use that phrase and it drives me and my husband crazy. So if anyone knows what I'm talking about, I'll just leave it at that. ואתה כותב, אלה תולדות יעקב, בני בניו שהיו 70 והאח נולדו. That the children were already born. אבל פה, כיצד יוסף היה בן 17 שנה, ונתקנאו בו אחיו, ונתגלגל הדבר שיוסף הורד מצרימה, ונולדו לו במצרים מנשה ואפרים, ושלח יוסף בשביל אביו וביתו עד שהיו 70, וכל זה היה צריך משה רבנו לכתוב, שהזה הוכיחה ב70 נפש ירדו אבותיך. And the Rashbam explains, I'm not necessarily sure it's a better shot explanation, but he says, listen, the actual list of children we spoke about in Perek Lamed Hey, right, 2 parakim ago. And later, we'll see also, we'll learn it as well, that famous list of the 70 who go down to Egypt. Later, we're going to talk about the 70 souls who go down to Egypt. And he says here, it's basically a Toldot introduction to how we get to those 70. Right? He says it is a genealogical list. It's just in delay, right? The rest of it's going to come later. But first, I need to tell you the story of Yosef in order to explain to you how we actually got to that genealogical list. And I brought you this for 2 reasons, because it is sort of a technical piece. And one of it is so that you realize, again, if you look in the first 11 parakim of Breishit, you'll see this very much, how important genealogical lists are in the eyes of the Torah and in the eyes of the Parshanim 1,000 years later. Okay, these genealogical lists are really, really critical. They're looked at as real crossroads, and they have historical significance. Meaning, it's like having your family tree where you open it and you say, "Oh, how much nachat I have from all this, all this progeny that was created." That genealogical lists have theological and emotional importance in the eyes of Tanakh. And so the Parshanim take it very seriously that here we have the phrase Toldot, but there's no list here. And they say, don't worry, there was a list before and there was going to be a list later. But another piece of why I wanted to bring this is because it frames the story of Yosef not as, hey, I want to tell you a nice story about the children of Yaakov, but it frames it as this is the precursor for how we got to Egypt. And that we didn't just want to jump into the story in the beginning of Sefer Shemot, hey, we live in Egypt, here's how we are, this is where we are, but that we are told the whole narrative about how we got there to begin with, because it's an unusual situation, right? It's an unusual situation for us to be living in Chutz Haaretz. We just said that Yaakov chooses to live be'eretz v'gurei aviv. He does differently than Esav. He's living in the family plot, right? And so we have to go through and tell a whole story about how we got to be living elsewhere. And that's really what the story of Yosef comes to tell us. Not just the important meaning about family and how family relates to the political, but that how we actually get physically to Egypt. I don't want to just jump to that piece and say that we were there, because I want us to see that there was a process as to why we ever left Israel to begin with. Okay. Moving on to the rivalry between the siblings, unfortunately. Okay. אלה תולדות יעקב, יוסף בן 17 שנה היה רואה את אחיו בצאן, והוא נער את בני בלהה ואת בני זלפה, נשי אביו, ויבא יוסף את דיבתם רעה אל אביהם. Now we have really a whole bunch of pieces here in this pasuk. Here we have Yosef. He's 17 years old. He is again, I would not look at the translation here. It's not necessarily how I'm going to explain it, but he is a helper for the children of Bilhah and the children of Zilpah. Those are the children of the handmaids. And it says that he brings bad reports to his father. Now I really want to unpack this pasuk because it offers us a bunch of really significant pieces. The fact that Yosef, who's 17, which is young, by the way, it's young in biblical terms. He's 17 and he's hanging out with the children of the handmaidens. Now that we already, a lot of us have learned these stories before, and we have different ideas in our mind, and there's truth to a lot of them, I think. I want to just offer a few that maybe are a little bit less spoken about. Immediately, when we see the words Bilhah and Zilpah, before we hear about what Yosef does to his brothers, it immediately draws us into the world of the rivalry between the wives. Meaning before we get to the children, and we'll talk about the relationship between those rivalries in a few minutes, but immediately we're drawn into this world of, if we remember that really painful, complex story of Yaakov and his wives, and the jealousy between them. The second we mention Bilhah and Zilpah, we should go back to that story, even more so that now Rachel is not alive anymore, and so we're immediately drawn into the parental rivalry before we even get into the brothers. And I want us to also notice a very small detail in the pasuk, which is that they're called the Nashim of Yaakov. Now they were Nashim, they were not Pilagshim, but they were often called the Shfachot. And here it specifically says Nashim. It could just be Stam, reminding us of their status, but it also could be that that their status, that mentioning again the fact that there is full wives is actually hinting to the fact that their status is raised once Rachel is no longer alive. Perhaps, not necessarily so, but the fact that it calls them the Neshei Yaakov and doesn't write the Shfachot does seem to ring in our ears as more significant. And we see here that Yosef is hanging out with, it says first Bnei Bilhah and then Zilpah, and Bnei Bilhah was the handmaiden of Rachel, and so it also makes sense that that Yosef is hanging out with the children of Bilhah. But the fact that he's hanging out with them and not the other brothers does strike us as somewhat off, right? We're not sure why, if he's the child of those, I would say, primary wives, that he's not hanging out with them. And then we're told this last piece, that he really is, that he was a tattletale. And when we read this first pasuk, I think that we're supposed to look at Yosef as an annoying younger brother, right? That is the impression created by this pasuk, and I think that it's a correct one. Again, I'm not besmirching, right? But we're talking about them as real people. The pasukim present them as real people. Our sense from this pasuk is that he's annoying, and we already know that he's annoying. Okay. Another significant piece is that we have here two really important words. Actually, no, I'm going to wait. I'm going to wait a minute with that, actually. One more pasuk. V'Yisrael ahav et Yosef mikol banav, kiven zekunim hulo, ve'asa lo ktoret pasim. Now, before we get to the why question of why Yaakov feels differently towards his son, we'll just point out that he, definitely has an affinity towards him, as it says in the pasuk, because he was born when he was already much older. It's really funny. I was just speaking to a friend who's a number of years older than me, and she has a 1-year-old, and there's a very large age gap between her 5th child and the first 4. And she was speaking to me about how sweet it is to have a young little baby in the house when her other kids are already much older. And I said to her, the meaning, the reason is really, I think, pretty clear. Obviously, sometimes if that child came through, a lot more work and difficulty, that there's a sweetness in the fact that they're simply around. But there's also something really sweet about little kids as opposed to your older kids, because older kids take up a lot more space in our heart. Little kids take up a lot of, there's a great phrase in Hebrew that I like by Daphne Meir, Zechron Brachav, Harut Ruchanit and Harut Fizi. That little kids is a physical labor, much more than older children, who take up a lot more mental energy and emotional energy. And little kids are just, yummy, and they'll give you a hug and you have to feed them, and their needs are really, really simple once you get into the older years. So I think that that's also sort of reflecting a little bit behind here in the Psukim, that he's his young child born into his younger years. Of course, we'll get back to the Rachel piece about how he certainly has affinity for Yosef because he's the wife of his quote unquote more loved wife. We'll get back to that in a little bit. And he makes him this Ktorat Pasim. He makes him this special coat. Vayir'u echav ki oto ahav avihem mikol echav. Vayisneu oto velo yechlu debo b'shalom. Now, here we have, again, a recipe for disaster. There are a number of reasons why the brothers don't like Yosef. One is that he's a tattletale. He's annoying to them. He annoys them. Now, many times younger siblings annoy their older siblings. It's not just that older siblings are jealous of their siblings, but the little kids really they annoy, they want to be with them and they annoy them. That's piece number one. Piece number two is that he gets this special coat, which we'll talk about in a minute what that actually is. And three is that they are jealous because their father favors him. And so those are three really great reasons why the brothers don't like Yosef. And there's a really important piece here that was pointed out to me recently when I read a new commentary on this story. We'll get to it in 2 more slides. Sorry about that. What is Ektorat Pasim? Okay. We really don't know is the real answer. That's total, complete answer. But we have some thoughts about it because it comes up in one other place in Tanakh. The precise meaning of Ektorat Pasim remains unclear. In Shmuel Bet, the garment is mentioned as a distinctive dress of virgin daughters of royalty. There it's in the story of Tamar, of David and Tamar. Josephus describes it as a long-sleeved tunic reaching to the ankle. In Aramaic and Rabbinic Hebrew, pas means the palm of the hand and the sole of the foot, meaning Ektorat Pasim reaches from here, the edge to that edge. What we call meresmis in fancy terms, from one edge to the other. Radak took pasim to mean striped, which is how most of us read it and see it, and see it depicted in media. The Septuagint and the Vulgate, meaning the Syriac translation of the Torah and the Latin translation of the Torah, specifically that's a Christian one, render the Hebrew a robe of many colors. Again, I want us to know that we don't particularly know what it means. Ancient Near Eastern art may shed some light on the subject. An Egyptian tomb painting at Beni Hassan from the 1890 is a typo. Here it's 1300 BCE, features a Semitic clan with the men and women wearing multicolored tunics draped over one shoulder and reaching below the knees. Another Egyptian tomb has a representation of Syrian ambassadors bringing tribute to Tutankhamen. They are dressed in elaborately designed long robes wrapped around the body and over the shoulders. A mural fresco in the palace of King Zimrilim at Mari in southeast Syria shows figures dressed in garments made of many small rectangular panels of multicolored cloth. Again, what exactly it is, we don't know. It seems that it probably had cultural significance that was different in different places, but it was something really elaborate that made someone know that they were loved. That's certainly clear. Okay, back to those psukim. There's a really interesting play that, again, is going to bring us to a little bit of a broader zoom out piece regarding the general stories of Yosef. I want us to notice that there's an interplay between two concepts, the concept of speech and the concept of sight. Now, it's also just, I'm always a little bit, as much as I teach from a literary perspective and I bring you research and et cetera, I have a really healthy dose of skepticism about these things, which I think is important. And so it's not the exact word of diba, okay, which would make it a more significant literary play. And the fact is that we as humans function throughout our speech and our eyes, okay? What we see and what we say are obviously the two main ways we communicate, but either way, I think it's very significant, mostly for how it culminates at the end of the story, which is that the two ways that that the difficulty through which they relate to each other manifests itself in the way they speak it and that they see. Yosef speaks badly about his brothers, and in a few minutes he'll speak his dreams. He'll tell them his dreams, which also really, really, really annoy them. And the brothers see, right? They observe how their brother is treated by their father, and it deeply bothers them. Now, this is significant, I think, mostly because in the end of the story, that this comes to fruition in a really powerful way. In Perek Memhei, V'hinei enechem ro'ot. This is Yosef speaking. Your eyes see. Ve'enei achi Binyamin kifi hamedaber elechem. Vayinashek lekol echad vayef alehem v'achre chen diburu echav ito. That he says to them, you see, right? You see who I am now. And when they reunite in Egypt and he tells them who he is, they're able to speak to him. It's a very poignant, coming full circle later on in the story. And at the end, in the last parak, when after it seems they really weren't healed from their trauma of all those years, and once Yaakov dies, the brothers think that Yosef is going to take revenge. And he says, Yosef says to his brothers, don't be scared of me. He says, I will economically provide for you. I will not throw you back into the famine of Canaan, even though our father is dead. I will take care of you and your children. And he comforted them. Here plays on the fact that Yaakov won't be comforted soon when he sees that his son, or he thinks his son is killed. Vayidaber al libam. Okay, and again, that speech, okay, and if we again zoom out into our broader piece about our own lives and our own relationships with our family and with our siblings, that being able to speak peacefully is a really huge step. It takes a lot of us many, many years, right? And it's not going to be the same with all of our siblings or all of our family members. I'm always going to speak in the personal. It's not always true in my personal life, but I'm just always going to speak in the personal because these are universal concepts that, that element of being able to speak to the hearts and to speak in a way that resonates with our siblings is a real avodah. I sometimes it's not for the better, but as I watch my kids grow up, I sort of overanalyze in my own brain, watching ways of communication between them develop. And even knowing these things, I'm only a parent, right? I shouldn't have a heavy hand in the way that they're always communicating with each other. And you see patterns already forming when they're younger. And I'm like thinking, okay, so hopefully when you're 25, you're gonna learn how to talk nicer. Stam, I hope that'll happen earlier. But it's just a truism, you know what I'm saying? And here we have Yosef at the end of life, they're finally able to communicate with each other in a better way. We'll talk a lot more about that when we get to that story, that part of the narrative. Okay, now one other piece about Yaakov. I'm gonna stop the share for a second. Oh no, I already spoiled it. Okay, hold on a second. So one more piece about the Yaakov. Okay, and then we're gonna see the little drawing that I had a lot of fun making. So why does Yaakov favor his child? Now, I've already given part of the explanation, which is that he's the child of Rachel, and he had a special affinity for Rachel, and therefore he's going to like her children more. Now, this is a really hard piece. I'm going to get to that like moral fetch I have in my heart, but I'll take it to a different level. I love my own children. I wouldn't say I'm a children person. Okay, I'm really a book person, and I love my own kids, and I love the children of the people I love, meaning friends of mine. I don't like run to like hug little kids, and I don't love the mess and smells. Like, I've learned to deal with my own kids, but like, it's really, some of us are better at that. Some of us are made to be good, and some of us just aren't. Like, I have a doctorate, i.e. I'm not. So, and like, but my people that I love their kids. And I love their kids like I love my children. And that includes, children of my family, and it includes children of my friends. And I think there's something very natural about that. So before we get to what's still that moral question in our heart of like, how do we have one of our patriarchs who love one of his kids more than the other? I think that piece, we can all just recognize that. And some of you just might be these like, Mother Earth people who like love all babies. So, I do also love babies, but that's been an acquired love as I've had them myself. But there is that piece of that when we love somebody, we also love that which comes out of them. And so that's one piece that I think makes this a little bit more relatable. But we still have this question about, why does, also morally, like how do we have this situation where we have a parent who loves one more than all the rest? And I think two ideas I want to offer. One is on a very human plane, and one is on a broader theological plane. Okay, so we're going to get to the human plane. I'm going to get back to the screen. Now, I'm sure some of you already know what this is. Why doesn't he favor Binyamin? So it seems that he does favor Binyamin. Thank you, Racheli, for the question, because later on we see the tremendous strife that brothers have when they have to bring Binyamin, because Yosef drags him into the story. And they say, oh no, our father can't lose him as well. And underlying those psukim is also the fact that he loves Binyamin for being also part of Rachel's family. But as it is right now, that favoritism is coming through, as we see more through Yosef, because he's the center of the story right now. Binyamin is younger, and he's just not the focus of the story. But it seems that he also has a very soft spot for Binyamin that we'll see later on in the narrative. Thank you for that question. So for those of you who know, this is a simplified version of what's called a genogram. A genogram is a therapeutic tool. This is a simplified version. A therapeutic tool, you can go online and learn how to make them. The circles are for women and the squares, or I made them rectangles so I could fit in the names. The squares are for men. And a genogram is something, if you're ever in social work school, it's part of the way you have to make them to graduate. A lot of times when people will go to therapy, you do this as well. And it's a way, and you're supposed to go back 3 generations, and it's a way to map out and see what has happened in one's family. What traumas have there been? What illnesses have there been? Hold on, I'm gonna check out the chat. Oh, I can see it here. So it really gives you a broader perspective on your family. A lot of times what people notice when they make genograms is that let's say something happened in a parent's life. Let's say, God forbid, in my mother's life, a parent of hers passed away when she was 15, and all of a sudden, it's not true. All of a sudden, when she, when her child turned 15, something started going awry in the family, because a lot of times, often, we get ticked off subconsciously when someone in our life is reaching an age or approaching a point in their life that reminds us of a previous difficulty or trauma that we went through. A lot of times these are things that people start to figure out once they really chart everything through. So I made a genogram of the family of Abraham. Now, for those of you who were in my Elul class, this is a piece that I mentioned there as well, but I want to bring it to our broader audience now in this course. This is a fun Yosefa therapeutic way to say something that the Midrash and a lot of our Parshanim have said as well. There's no credit being taken for this. I just thought that depicting it pictorially gives us a different perspective on it. And the fact is that when we ask ourselves, how does Yaakov favor his son, that the answer needs to be that he is simply doing what all those have done before him. He is not unique in the way that he's relating to his children. We see this from the beginning, okay? Again, here we have the family of Abraham. The squiggly line was my way of showing a tense relationship. There's all different keys and ways you could do this, but that's my way of showing a tense relationship. And so we have Abraham, who is going to actually initially not favor his child, but he's going to have to choose one of his children. And so he is going to choose, Yitzchak, obviously, and between Yitzchak and Ishmael, there is somewhat of a tense relationship, and Ishmael is going to be taken off the scene. In the family of Yitzchak and Rivka, we have, by the way, this was me really just having fun. So this F here is what is the genogram note for fraternal twins. So I'm assuming they're fraternal because they didn't look alike. Of course, they could be identical anyways. But here we have 2 twins that are had by Yitzchak and Rivka. And we have the tense relationship between Yaakov and Esav. And we have, of course, we know that in this case, Yitzchak favored Esav and Rivka favored Yaakov. And either way, he's the one who gets chosen. And here we come to the next family. And so all we have is a repeated pattern here. We have a repeated pattern where Yaakov was the favored child, certainly by his mother. That is said openly in the Psukim, that Yitzchak ahavet Esav and Rivka ahavat Yaakov. And here we have the family of Yaakov. So until somebody has broken this pattern, it will continue. And that is true of all family difficulty, trauma. Until somebody actively breaks the chain, it will continue throughout generations. Again, in a more, different context, whether it's alcoholism or abuse, or again, things that are classically charted in genograms, unless somebody breaks the pattern, it will continue showing up in the next generation. And so up until the family of Yaakov, nobody breaks the chain. And so also in the family of Yaakov, we have Yosef, who is favored. He's favored again because Rachel's the mother, find whatever reason you want. But Yaakov is really just being propelled forward by a pattern that is now 3 generations old. And so here I wrote again our squiggly line for the fact that Yosef has a tense relationship with all of the brothers, essentially. Again, Binyamin is a slightly different category that we'll talk about later, but he has a tense relationship with everybody in the story. And so we have the favoring of Yosef, and really poignantly, and again, something that we spoke about in the Elul class, is that this pattern is broken. This pattern is broken when the brothers have their really moving, I would say, reunion isn't really at the end of the story, when they have their real reckoning with each other. And we saw one pasuk of that right before in Perek Nun, that when they finally are at peace with each other, yes, okay, that when they finally are able to break this dysfunctional pattern, it's what happens at the end of Sefer Breishit. And this is why we don't see this, I believe, in later books of the Torah. Meaning we don't have this concept of a chosen child anymore. And I really believe that it is in Bishut, the fact that the brothers, that the Yosef and his brothers, after a very long, difficult, painful, dysfunctional story that we'll learn about in the coming year, that they break that pattern with each other and are able to create some sort of unity. And that's the reason why we don't see this happening anymore. It's a tremendous theme in the book of Breishit, but it really disappears on an individual level. Okay, and Racheli, your question regarding does he favor in the story of Ephraim and Manasseh, he doesn't favor, meaning he thinks that the eldest child should go to the right side, but we'll see that even there, that Yaakov breaks it himself. It's an unbelievable, that story within a story with the 2 brothers is exactly this, where Ephraim and Manasseh, Yosef wants it to get to that place where I'm going to have the older child receive what he should and the younger child receive what he should, but Yaakov himself switches his hands. And so there's a breaking of that pattern even there as well. Okay, we'll talk about the Bechira process. Okay, we'll talk about that. And so I don't want to talk about the blame piece. I don't think it's a matter of blame. I think that there is, and I'm going to zoom out here, there is a divine hand in all of this. Okay, meaning it's very clear to us throughout the story of Breishit that there is a divine process of choosing, and that God wanted this family to get to, right, he wanted us to start with the world, to take it down to Noach, to take it down to Shem, to take it down to Abraham, that there was a very providential choosing. And the way that it happens is through a favoring process. But that there's both the limud that we can have, about how it means to function within our own family. It doesn't take away from the fact that there was a broader providential significance to whittling down the families until it got to a very specific branch. But I want to zoom out on that piece. On a different level, which is that if we're able to stomach the fact that there is a choosing process, that I would say again, that Yaakov is sort of an unknowing part of, that if we're able to stomach the fact that a parent can favor their child, but that we don't think that they are, that there's something wrong with the parent, but rather that it was because there was something that child was destined to do, I'm going to phrase that better. That I just spoke about the fact that Yaakov is part of this 3-generational process of a favoring process, that favoring process has divine significance, that there clearly was a need for it, as we see through the development of Sefer Breishit. And we have a little bit of our internal moral fetch about what that really means and how we can feel about that. But one of the ways we can look at it is that, yeah, we can ask that question about the parent, but it also must be because that child really was singled out for something. I'll take a very different example. I'm right now reading, after a many-year delay, I'm reading Rav Yisrael Meir Lau's autobiography, right? I forgot what it's called in English. You know what I'm talking about. Out of the Depths or something. And I never read it, and I'm bad about reading Holocaust things. I just find it really horrible, and I just often run away from it instead of reading it. So anyways, one of the things he talks about is that his father, who had tremendous love and respect for Naphtali, the elder brother, i.e. Rabbi Benning Lau's father, but that he told him, the father who was a very illustrious Rav, and they're from 8 generations of Rabbanim in all the lands they lived in, Italy and Poland, that he said to him, you need to watch this child because he's going to be a big rabbi. Meaning from the age of 5, before that child knew how to speak Hebrew, learn Torah, anything, that he told Naphtali, who was already an 18-year-old boy during the war, that you need to watch over him because he is going to continue the rabbinic dynasty of the family. Now, it wasn't, and it was never, it's also never recounted in this as any favoring, or it was that he recognized that this child has a destiny, and that he's supposed to, or he wanted him to have a certain destiny, whatever it may be. Now, where am I getting at? Is that it is very clear to me that the favoring process of one child over the other throughout the story of Breishit is a microcosm for the concept of the chosen people. Which only comes up much later in the Torah. Okay, it comes up in Sefer Dvarim. It's not in many places. It takes on a much broader theology, but it actually doesn't even appear all that often. That the theology of the chosen people is a macrocosm of this idea, and I really believe this, the following sentence, that it's not because, and again, Rabbi Yehuda Levi wouldn't agree. He thinks that Jews are inherently different creatures. Certainly this is influenced by my Western sense of morality. I don't think it's because Jews are better humans. I think that it's because there was a selection process of them being chosen for a certain tafkid. And it's not about rejecting others. It's about choosing them for that job. And some people might look at that sentence and look at it as semantics. I just yesterday was witnessing a very, very, very liberal friend of family really just say that, this doctrine is horrific. It needs to be, completely thrown into the garbage. And that might be, that's a perspective. I think that you then have to reckon with Sefer Dvarim and where that concept comes from. But I really believe that Sefer Breishit is a microcosm for this idea. And so if you can stomach morally the idea that a parent can look at one child, again, we get thrown off by the word vayehav. Vayehav doesn't necessarily mean the love in the way that we mean it today in our really Western concept of love. It definitely means a favoring. It means a favoring, not necessarily to the exclusion of others, but it definitely means a favoring. And so if we can wrap our head and our heart around this idea that we can look at a child and say, they're really meant for X, they really have that in them, not because the others are less or problematic, but because they were born with that gift, then I really think that it's a precursor for this idea that the Jewish people have a destiny that is different than other peoples around the world. It doesn't reject them. It doesn't mean that they're less. It just means that they were chosen for that idea. Taking it to like a really banal example, again, I think it's a lot about how we take these things in our heart. you know, you have two siblings and one of them is, you know, really good at sports and the other one likes sports but isn't as great at them. So the first one is going to make the team, right? And the other one is not going to make the team, and they're going to, I don't know, try out for the play instead, or they're going to try out, they're going to start doing art classes. They just weren't, you know, that wasn't what they were necessarily meant to do. It wasn't what, you know, where their gifts were pushing them. And so I think that it's a lot more about, you know, gifts pushing us a certain way, as opposed to a rejection of others. Just an idea, a broader theological idea about where I think that this favoring.
Excuse me.
History.
In
I'm
the
going to
sense
take a break now, take 2 minutes, and I'm happy to, if anyone has a question.
that this artist, Ellen, who's speaking, was the fastest runner of all the girls in her class when she was a kid, and only one boy was faster. So you don't take art lessons because you're not good in sports. Don't say that.
Okay, I'm sorry. No, I didn't mean that. It's true. And I totally mean it. And I have children who are gifted in different ways. I was just giving a banal example to try and draw that point home, but it's certainly to no exclusion of anybody's talents. I have to say, by the way, that, you know, one of the more inspiring things I learned was last year already. Who remembers time anymore, right? Who knows? The baby who's 7 months old, half the world, you know, half of my personal world still hasn't met her. So a piece that was really inspiring to me is there's that really wonderful series on Netflix. Sorry, my classes aren't for the theologically weary. A really wonderful series on Netflix about Michael Jordan called The Last Dance, The Last Game. I forget which one. Excellent. If you haven't seen it, there is a lot of depth to that series. And one of the things that I'm a basketball player, by the way, so I also, you know, take this more seriously. That one of the pieces that I loved in the early episodes is that you learn that he was an excellent college player, but he became phenomenal in between his second and third year of college playing. That he, over a span of a few months in the summer, like completely, you know, and that's one of the things you take home from this whole series is how he has unbelievable willpower and unbelievable strength that he honed in when he was in his early 20s. And that was a really inspiring piece for me, to think about, again, in any realm of things that, like, you know, so you're 34 and you wanted to do X, you still haven't done it yet. So what, you know, you're going to be 38 anyways, so just go and do it now, you know? So anyways, okay. So Ellen, I totally hear you. And I don't want that to be the exclusion of anything else.
Okay. I'd like to
I
ask
see
a
that
question.
I've gone over our time.
Okay. Can I ask a question?
Yes, definitely ask a question.
Okay, first of all, could you repeat the name of the series you just mentioned now?
Yeah, it's on Netflix. I think it's the last game.
Okay,
If
and you find it,
well, yeah, nod your heads if I got that right. The last game.
and you find it on YouTube?
No, it's on Netflix.
Netflix.
Yeah, Last Dance. Oh no, thank you, Rachel. It's The Last Dance. It's on
Okay.
Netflix. Yeah, Netflix is, you know, has a lot of junk, but there's also some really great things there. I might quote a few things on there.
Netflix, Netflix.
FLIX. Yeah, it's one of the more central live streaming services out there. It's the new TV in today's day and age. But it's an excellent series, but you have to get it there.
Okay, I just want to comment, you speak very, very fast. English is not my native language, and
Okay.
I find it very difficult to follow you. You kind of swallow words, so if you could just slow down.
No problem. I will try my best.
Yeah,
Also,
okay.
I hope my internet, and I hope this is my best internet room. So I'm happy if anyone wants to write me. By the way, I'm going to write my email.
Yes,
So
what's your
you can
email?
also send me any comments, whether technical or less so. I'm happy to answer them. And, you know, this forum has its limitations in how much we can have sharing. So I'm going to write to the general group, and definitely if there's a technical issue, please tell us from the beginning. I'll try my best to speak as clearly as possible. But that's my email if anyone wants to write to me. Anything technical or less so.
Okay, are you also